The world knew Joe DiMaggio as baseball royalty and Marilyn Monroe as Hollywood's golden goddess. But on January 14th, 1954, their wedding night at San Francisco City Hall, Marilyn whispered something into Joe's ear that made the legendary Yankee Clipper's face turn white. That secret, revealed for the first time in a locked hotel room overlooking the Pacific, would haunt DiMaggio for 45 years and explain why he never forgave Hollywood, why he sent roses to her grave 3 times a week for 2 decades, and why his last words on his deathbed were about finally joining her. But what Marilyn told Joe that night wasn't just about her past. It was about her present, her future, and the invisible chains that bound her to a system that had stripped away everything, including the name her mother gave her. The secret started with a name. Not Marilyn Monroe, not even Norma Jean Baker, but a third identity that Hollywood executives had buried so deep, even Marilyn herself had almost forgotten it existed. And when she finally spoke it out loud to the one man she thought could save her, she set in motion a love story that would end in tragedy, but never in surrender. Before we dive deeper into this untold story, if you're fascinated by the hidden truths behind Hollywood's golden age, subscribe to our channel. We bring you the stories they never wanted you to know. January 14th, 1954, began like a carefully choreographed Hollywood production, but it would end with a confession that shattered everything. San Francisco City Hall was under siege. 250 reporters and photographers had descended on the building, turning what should have been a simple civil ceremony into a media circus. The crowd outside numbered in the thousands, climbing trees and scaling light poles just to catch a glimpse of America's sweethearts. Joe DiMaggio arrived first, characteristically early, wearing a dark blue suit. At 40, he had been retired from baseball for just 2 years, but his legend had only grown. The Yankee Clipper. The man with the 56-game hitting streak that would never be broken. He had walked away from baseball at the peak of his powers because he refused to become a shadow of himself. Dignity mattered to Joe DiMaggio more than money or fame. Marilyn Monroe arrived 45 minutes late, wearing a chocolate-brown suit with an ermine collar, her platinum blonde hair perfectly styled. At 27, she was the most photographed woman in the world. Gentlemen Prefer Blondes had made her a sensation. Her face sold magazines. Her figure stopped traffic. Her breathy voice had become the template for an entire generation of actresses. The ceremony lasted 9 minutes. Judge Charles Perry performed the service while flashbulbs exploded and reporters shouted questions. She said, "I do," in that famous whisper. He said it firmly, like a man making a promise he intended to keep. And then they were escorted through a back exit to avoid the mob, hustled into Joe's Cadillac, and driven to the Clifton Motel overlooking the Pacific Ocean, where room 307 had been reserved under a false name. But what happened in room 307 that night was never captured by cameras, never reported in newspapers, never whispered about in Hollywood gossip columns. Because what Marilyn told Joe in those first hours of their marriage was so devastating that even decades later, those who knew about it refused to speak of it publicly. The hotel room was modest. A queen-sized bed, 2 nightstands, a small desk near the window overlooking the dark Pacific. Joe had specifically chosen this motel because it was ordinary, anonymous, where they could have a few hours of privacy. Marilyn stood by the window for a long time after they arrived, still wearing her brown suit, her back to Joe, staring out at the blackness of the ocean. She hadn't spoken since they left City Hall. Joe sat on the edge of the bed, loosening his tie, giving her space, waiting. He had learned during their courtship that Marilyn operated on her own timeline, that pushing her only made her retreat further into herself. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, not the breathy whisper that had become her trademark. This voice was lower, harder, laced with exhaustion mixed with rage. "Joe, there's something you need to know before we go any further. Something about who I really am. Or rather, who they made me." She turned from the window, and for the first time that day, Joe saw her without the performance. Her face was set in an expression he had never seen before, something that looked like a soldier about to report casualties. She walked to the desk, sat down, and for the next 3 hours Marilyn Monroe told her husband a story that would haunt him until his dying day. The story began with a name: Norma Jean Mortensen. That was the name on her birth certificate, given by a mother who would spend most of her life in psychiatric institutions. But even that wasn't her real name, not completely, because her mother later changed it to Norma Jean Baker. So from the very beginning, before Hollywood ever touched her, Marilyn's identity was already fractured, already uncertain, already a construction rather than a solid foundation. She told Joe about being discovered at 16 while working in a defense plant during the war, about signing contracts without reading them, trusting men she shouldn't have trusted, agreeing to things she didn't fully understand because she thought it was her only way out of foster care and a marriage to a boy she didn't love. And then came 1946, the year that changed everything. Ben Lyon, the casting director at 20th Century Fox, told her that Norma Jean Baker wasn't a movie star name. It was too plain, too forgettable, too real. He spent an afternoon throwing out options while 19-year-old Norma Jean sat in his office watching her identity being erased and rebuilt in real time. Marilyn Monroe. It sounded like a star. It sounded like money. But the name was just the beginning of the transformation, just the first layer of Norma Jean that would be stripped away and replaced with something more marketable, more profitable, more controllable. Marilyn's voice grew harder as she described what came next, and Joe DiMaggio began to realize he had been naive about Hollywood. He had thought it was just show business, just entertainment. But as Marilyn talked, he understood it was something much more sinister. The studio system of the 1940s and early 1950s operated with absolute control over its contracted players. When you signed with a studio, you didn't just agree to make movies. You agreed to let them manage every aspect of your existence: your hair color, your weight, your teeth, your name, your romantic relationships, your public persona, even your private thoughts. The contract Marilyn signed at 19 gave 20th Century Fox the right to suspend her without pay if she gained weight, if she refused cosmetic procedures, if she declined publicity appearances, if she refused roles, if she dated anyone the studio deemed inappropriate, if she got pregnant. They started with her body. Her natural hair was light brown with reddish tones. The studio had it bleached platinum blonde, a shade that required maintenance every 2 weeks and left her scalp burned. They decided her teeth were too crooked, so they had them capped. They decided her nose was too long, so they had it surgically reduced. They decided her chin was too weak, so they had a small implant inserted. They decided her hairline was too low, so they had electrolysis performed to raise it. But the physical transformation was nothing compared to the psychological conditioning. They sent her to acting coaches who taught her to speak in that breathy whisper, to move with that calculated wiggle, to play dumb even though her IQ tested at 168. They sent her to publicity managers who created a biography that bore no resemblance to her actual childhood because orphanages and foster homes weren't sexy. And the most devastating part was that Marilyn told him she couldn't refuse. The contracts were ironclad. If she broke them, the studio could sue her for every cent she would ever make. If she spoke publicly about the reality of the studio system, they could blacklist her from every studio in Hollywood. She was trapped in a system that owned her more completely than any legal slavery, except this was legal, celebrated, and envied by millions of girls who dreamed of becoming the next Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn stood up from the desk and walked back to the window. "They don't control just my image, Joe. They control me. When I eat, who I see, where I go, what I say. I can't even choose what color lipstick to wear without studio approval. And if I try to fight back, if I show up late or forget my lines, they remind me that there are 1,000 girls who would kill for my position, that Marilyn Monroe is a creation that can be replaced if Norma Jean doesn't cooperate." She turned to face him, and Joe saw tears running down her face, cutting tracks through her makeup. "I've been Marilyn for 7 years now, 7 years of pretending to be someone I'm not. And I'm so tired, Joe. I'm so tired of being her. But I don't know how to stop. I don't know if Norma Jean even exists anymore or if she died somewhere along the way and nobody noticed." Joe DiMaggio sat very still for a long moment. Then he stood up, crossed the room, and put his arms around his new wife. And this man, who had faced down the greatest pitchers in baseball history without flinching, who had maintained stoic dignity through every triumph and defeat of his career, broke down and wept. Joe DiMaggio made a promise that night in room 307, a promise that would define the rest of his life and ultimately break his heart. "We'll get you out," he told Marilyn, holding her face in his hands. "I don't care how much it costs. I don't care how long it takes. We'll break that contract and get you free. You'll never have to be Marilyn Monroe again if you don't want to be." It was a promise born of love and rage and a fundamental belief that no human being should be owned by a corporation. Joe DiMaggio had walked away from baseball because he refused to let the Yankees control him. He assumed that Marilyn could do the same with Hollywood. But Joe DiMaggio didn't understand Hollywood the way he understood baseball. Baseball had rules. Hollywood had something far more powerful: illusion. The trouble started almost immediately. They flew to Tokyo for their honeymoon, but the studio had arranged for Marilyn to detour to Korea to perform for American troops. Joe thought it was optional. Marilyn knew it wasn't. When he tried to intervene, the studio executive laughed and reminded him that Marilyn Monroe had obligations that superseded her marriage. Marilyn went to Korea. Joe went with her, watching from the sidelines as his new wife performed for over 60,000 servicemen who screamed and whistled. He watched her smile and wiggle and blow kisses, playing the role the studio had created. And when she came off stage, glowing with adrenaline, Joe saw something that terrified him. She had loved it. For those few minutes on stage, being Marilyn Monroe had made her feel powerful and desired in a way that being Norma Jean never had. That's when Joe began to understand the full horror of what the studio had done. They hadn't just changed her name and appearance. They had conditioned her to need the performance, to crave the validation, to feel alive only when she was being Marilyn. Back in Los Angeles, Joe tried everything. He hired attorneys to review Marilyn's contract, looking for loopholes. The lawyers came back with bad news. The contract was airtight. The only way out was to buy out the contract, and the studio was demanding an astronomical sum that even Joe's baseball fortune couldn't cover. He tried accompanying Marilyn to the studio, sitting on set, making his presence known. But the studio fought back by scheduling early morning calls when Joe was asleep, by sending cars that, accidentally, went to wrong addresses so Joe couldn't accompany her. The marriage lasted 274 days. 9 months of trying to save someone who wasn't sure she wanted to be saved. 9 months of watching the woman he loved disappear behind the mask of Marilyn Monroe every time she left their house. The beginning of the end came in September 1954, during the filming of The 7-Year Itch. Billy Wilder had conceived of a scene that would become iconic: Marilyn standing over a subway grate while air blew her white dress up around her waist. He planned to shoot it on location in New York City at 2 o'clock in the morning. But word leaked out. By the time filming began, over 5,000 people had gathered to watch. They packed the sidewalks, hung out of windows, climbed onto parked cars, all waiting to see Marilyn's dress blow up. The studio had encouraged the turnout because publicity sold tickets. Joe DiMaggio arrived at the shoot unannounced. He hadn't known about the scene until Marilyn mentioned it casually. He came to support her, to be present, to remind everyone that Marilyn Monroe had a husband. What he saw that night ended his marriage and confirmed every terrible thing Marilyn had told him on their wedding night about how Hollywood viewed her. Billy Wilder called action. The subway grate began blowing air. Marilyn's white dress billowed up around her waist, revealing her underwear to 5,000 screaming men and dozens of cameras. She laughed and tried to hold the dress down, playing coy, performing the innocence that was Marilyn's trademark. Wilder called cut. They reset. They did it again. 14 takes in total, each one revealing more of Marilyn to the crowd. Joe DiMaggio stood in the back, his face completely white, his fists clenched. This wasn't about jealousy. This was about watching the woman he loved being reduced to a commodity, being displayed like merchandise, being stripped of dignity, while she smiled and pretended it was empowering. When Marilyn finally came off set, glowing from the crowd's reaction, Joe was gone. She found him back at their hotel room, sitting in the dark. "I can't do this," he said quietly. "I can't watch them destroy you and pretend it's entertainment. I thought I could save Norma Jean, but she's already gone, isn't she? They killed her years ago." Marilyn tried to explain it was just a movie, just work, but Joe shook his head. "You're never not Marilyn Monroe. Even here, even now, you're performing. I don't even know if you know you're doing it anymore." On October 27, 1954, just 274 days after their wedding, Marilyn Monroe's attorney announced she was divorcing Joe DiMaggio on grounds of mental cruelty. The public was shocked, but the truth was simpler and sadder. Joe DiMaggio had failed to keep the promise he made on his wedding night. He couldn't break Marilyn free from Hollywood's control. He couldn't save Norma Jean. The divorce didn't end Joe's love for Marilyn. It intensified it, transformed it into a mission. He became her guardian angel, watching from a distance, ready to intervene whenever she needed him. And she needed him often during those 7 years as her life spiraled into chaos. In 1955, Marilyn fled to New York to study at the Actors Studio under Lee Strasberg. She wanted to be taken seriously as an actress. But 20th Century Fox sued her for breach of contract, and after a year of legal battles, she was forced to return to Hollywood and resume making the same kinds of films she had been trying to escape. Joe was there when she came back defeated. In 1956, Marilyn married Arthur Miller, the playwright. Joe attended the wedding, though it broke his heart. The marriage lasted 5 years and produced no children, despite Marilyn's desperate desire to be a mother. She suffered multiple miscarriages, each loss devastating her further. Joe was there through all of it. When Miller divorced her in 1961, Joe flew to Nevada to be with her. When she was hospitalized for depression and barbiturate addiction, Joe paid the bills. When she called him at 3 in the morning, incoherent and terrified, Joe talked her down. And through all those years, Joe DiMaggio's hatred of Hollywood grew from a personal grievance into a consuming rage. He refused to attend any Hollywood parties. He declined every interview that mentioned Marilyn. He told friends that the entertainment industry was a meat grinder that chewed up human beings and spat out commodities. By 1962, Marilyn was at her lowest point. She had been fired from Something's Got to Give after showing up to set only 12 times in 32 days. Her addiction to barbiturates and alcohol was unmanageable. Her affairs with the Kennedy brothers had become dangerous entanglements. Joe tried one more time to save her. In July 1962, just weeks before her death, he proposed again. "Marry me. We'll move to San Francisco. I'll take care of you. We'll get you clean." And for a moment, Marilyn considered it. But then she said no, because walking away meant admitting defeat, meant acknowledging that Hollywood had won, meant accepting that Norma Jean was truly dead. 3 weeks later, on August 5, 1962, Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her bedroom in Brentwood. The official cause of death was ruled probable suicide by overdose of barbiturates. She was 36 years old. Joe DiMaggio took control of Marilyn's funeral, excluding every Hollywood figure who tried to attend. No studio executives, no directors, no co-stars. The funeral at Westwood Memorial Park was limited to 31 people. It was the opposite of everything Marilyn Monroe's public life had been: small, private, dignified. Joe stood over her casket and said, "I love you. I love you. I love you." He said it over and over, as if repetition could reach her wherever she was. And then Joe DiMaggio made one final promise. He would make sure she was never forgotten, never abandoned, never alone again. He arranged for roses to be delivered to her crypt 3 times a week, every week, without fail. Red roses, 3 of them. The arrangement continued for 20 years, from 1962 until 1982. The florist had strict instructions: never reveal who was sending the flowers until after his death, never miss a delivery, and always include a small card with 5 words. "I still couldn't save you." Those 5 words revealed everything. Not "I love you," though he did. Not "I miss you," though he did. But "I still couldn't save you." A confession of failure, an acknowledgement of defeat, an apology that would continue for 2 decades. Joe never remarried. He lived quietly in San Francisco, managing his business interests, and every Tuesday and Friday, knowing that roses were being delivered to a woman who had been dead for years, but who he still loved with a devotion that bordered on obsession. Hollywood tried multiple times to make movies about Marilyn Monroe, to profit from her death the way they had profited from her life. Joe DiMaggio fought every single attempt. He threatened lawsuits. He mobilized Marilyn's estate to block productions. He used his fame to pressure studios into abandoning projects. Joe gave only one interview about Marilyn in all those years. It was in 1976, 14 years after her death. "People think they knew Marilyn Monroe," Joe said. "They saw her movies. They saw her photographs. But they didn't know her. They knew a performance, a construction, a product created by men who saw a vulnerable girl and turned her into a commodity. The real person, Norma Jean, died long before August 1962. She died in meetings with studio executives. She died during photo shoots. She died every time someone called her Marilyn Monroe and forgot there had ever been anyone else. Joe DiMaggio died on March 8, 1999, at the age of 84, from lung cancer and complications of old age. He spent his final days at his home in Hollywood, Florida, surrounded by family, but still fundamentally alone. His last coherent words were about Marilyn. "I'll finally get to see Marilyn," Joe whispered. Not "I'll see my parents" or "I'll be at peace," but "I'll finally get to see Marilyn." After 37 years of mourning, after 20 years of sending roses, after a lifetime of guilt and love and grief, Joe DiMaggio's final thought was of the woman he had married for 274 days and failed to save. The roses stopped coming to Marilyn's crypt after Joe's death, ending a ritual that had lasted for 2 decades. But the story of those roses became part of Hollywood legend. They became a symbol of a love that endured beyond death, of devotion that refused to accept defeat, even in the face of tragedy. But those who knew the real story saw the roses differently. They weren't symbols of romantic devotion. They were markers of failure. Each delivery was Joe DiMaggio saying, "I still couldn't save you. I tried, and I failed, and I'm sorry." They were a 20-year apology to a dead woman who had told him the truth about Hollywood on their wedding night, who had warned him about the system that owned her. The story of Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio is usually told as a tragic romance. The beauty and the baseball hero, the marriage that couldn't survive her fame, the devoted ex-husband who mourned her forever. But that version misses the point entirely. The real story is about what Hollywood did to a 19-year-old girl named Norma Jean Baker, how they erased her identity, controlled her body, monetized her sexuality, addicted her to performance, and then blamed her for being unstable when the psychological damage became impossible to hide. Joe DiMaggio understood this from the moment Marilyn confessed the truth on their wedding night. He spent the rest of his life trying to expose it, to fight it, to save one woman from it. He failed. Not because he didn't love Marilyn enough or try hard enough. He failed because the system was too big, too powerful, too deeply embedded in American culture to be defeated by one man's love. The studio system officially ended in the 1960s, but the mechanisms that controlled Marilyn never really went away. They evolved, became more sophisticated. Today's stars sign different contracts, but they still surrender control over their image, their privacy, their identity. Social media has replaced studio publicity departments, but it demands the same constant performance, the same carefully curated persona, the same sacrifice of authentic self for public consumption. Marilyn Monroe died in 1962, but Norma Jean Baker was killed long before that, murdered by a system that couldn't profit from an intelligent, complex woman, but could sell millions of tickets to see a blonde bombshell who played dumb and wiggled. Joe DiMaggio spent 45 years mourning both women, unable to save either one, carrying the guilt of his failure until his last breath. The roses he sent 3 times a week for 20 years weren't just flowers. They were witness. They were testimony. They were evidence of a crime that Hollywood committed and America celebrated. Each delivery said, "This happened. This was wrong. And I will not let you forget." On January 14th, 1954, in room 307 of the Clifton Motel in San Francisco, Marilyn Monroe told her new husband the truth about Hollywood's system of control. She confessed that she didn't own her name, her image, her body, or her identity. She revealed that the woman the world knew as Marilyn Monroe was a construction, a performance, a product manufactured by men who saw profit where she saw personhood. Joe DiMaggio listened and made a promise he would spend the rest of his life trying to keep. He would free her. He would save her. He would help Norma Jean reclaim her life. It was a promise born of love and naivety, of good intentions and misplaced confidence. He failed. The marriage lasted 274 days. Marilyn died 8 years later, still trapped in the performance, still unable to find Norma Jean beneath the layers of image and expectation. And Joe spent the next 37 years apologizing for his failure, sending roses that said, "I still couldn't save you." But perhaps the most tragic element is that Joe's failure wasn't personal. He failed because the fight was unwinnable from the beginning. You can't rescue someone from a system they've been conditioned to need. You can't free someone who's been taught that their identity is their prison. The wedding night confession changed both of their lives forever. It transformed Joe from a naive romantic into a bitter realist who understood that some systems are too powerful to be defeated by individual resistance. It confirmed for Marilyn that even the people who loved her couldn't change the fundamental reality of her situation. The roses were his testimony. The funeral was his defiance. The refusal to remarry was his loyalty. And his last words, "I'll finally get to see Marilyn," were his confession that despite everything, he had never stopped loving the woman he married for 274 days and mourned for 16,071. Joe DiMaggio knew the truth from January 14th, 1954, until March 8th, 1999. He carried it like a stone in his heart. He testified to it with roses 3 times a week for 20 years. He died still believing he had failed, still apologizing, still saying, "I couldn't save you." But maybe the real failure wasn't Joe's inability to save Marilyn. Maybe the real failure was a culture that created a system where Marilyn Monroe needed saving in the first place. Maybe the real failure was ours, for celebrating the performance while ignoring the person, for buying the tickets and magazines while a real woman suffocated behind the smile. And maybe the real legacy of that wedding night confession is about recognizing that every icon has a Norma gene behind it. Every performance hides a person. Every Marilyn Monroe was once someone real, someone with a different name and different dreams, someone who made a choice or had a choice made for them. That's what Marilyn told Joe on January 14th, 1954. That's what changed him forever. That's what he spent 45 years trying to make the world understand. And that's what we still refuse to fully acknowledge, because facing that truth would mean confronting our own complicity in the system that creates and destroys our icons. The roses have stopped coming to Marilyn's crypt. Joe DiMaggio is buried 400 miles away in San Francisco. Both of them are gone now, perhaps finally reunited, perhaps finally at peace. But the system that destroyed Norma Jean Baker and broke Joe DiMaggio's heart continues, evolved but fundamentally unchanged, still creating Marilyns, still erasing identities, still demanding the ultimate sacrifice for the chance at fame. And somewhere, in a quiet cemetery, 3 red roses that haven't been delivered in decades stand as a monument to a promise that couldn't be kept, a love that couldn't save, and a truth that still hasn't been fully heard.